Today's Irish Landscape Institute talk. It's National Tree Week, so we thought it would be a good idea to do a talk on trees as we're members of the Tree Council of Ireland. So today's talk is on the trees of the Phoenix Park. And to give it to us, we have John A. McCullen, who graduated from UCD with first class honours degree in horticulture in 1970, followed by an M.Sc in Landscape Ecology, Design and Maintenance from Wye College London. In 2007, he was awarded PhD by the University of Dublin for his thesis on the landscape history and management of the Phoenix Park from 1800 to 1880. John retired as Chief Park Superintendent of the OPW in 2012, and John has been responsible for the management and conservation of the Phoenix Park for almost 25 years. He was also involved in the conservation and restoration of many of the OPW's historic parks and gardens during this period. John is author of An Illustrated History of the Phoenix Park, published in 2009, and co-author of A Manual of Urban Trees with Richard Webb. More recently, he has authored The Phoenix Park, An Illustrated History of its Landscape and Management 1880 to 1980, which has just been published by the OPW. So, a great pleasure to introduce John McCullen.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank the ILI for the invitation to speak on trees during National Tree Week. And lest I forget to thank Hazel for her tuition on getting this far. So hopefully it will continue on. Yeah, the trees of the Phoenix Park, I mean, it was a nice broad subject that Mark had given me. And so really what I'll do, I think, in the time allocate will be to focus on a few areas of them, and of course storms are something that's very much in the public mind of late, but also we'll just look maybe at some of the historical aspect of it. So it's kind of a bird's eye view in a way of the trees in the park. So yeah, without further ado, then we can get on. There's about 27 or 8 slides if you're counting, and I know there's a time constraint as well, so Mark will use the guillotine when he thinks appropriate, so that's grand. Yeah. So just an overview here, just a few statistics, I suppose, on the park. It's over 707 hectares in size. About 1/3 of that are down to trees of different types, either shelter belt trees or avenues, clumps of trees, individual trees, and so on. This shot the lower end, people are familiar with the lower end of the park, probably the old park, but the lower end of the park with the Wellington Monument there coming down the quays is quite a landmark coming up. Now, the dominant tree species, of course, in the park are down to those on the screen there: oak, ash, lime, chestnut, sycamore, hawthorn, and of course elm I put in pink at the time. This slide was done some time ago. Of course, elm has been no longer features in the park. Although I do know there are some resistant elm types which will be trialed, I suppose, in due course. Of course, ash is under attack, is everywhere around the country, is also in the park here, and I gather there can be about 3 to 5% ash resistant to the Cholera disease. And of course, chestnut bleeding canker has also crept in. That seems to have stabilized in the park, and I suppose confirms my view that it's very respondent to climatic conditions of a certain type. So some years you get quite bad, other years not quite so bad. And of course, the sycamore is also a bit under attack as well. So we'll just continue on then. People ask, what's the oldest tree in the Phoenix Park? Well, the answer to that is I can't tell them, but basically, I think that what would be a very strong contender is this evergreen oak, which is in the Phoenix, in the US American ambassador's residence in the Phoenix Park, which was formerly the chief secretary's residence. So it's a Quercus ilex, and you can see here from the configuration of the trunk that it's fairly old. My guess is it's really only I suppose a guesstimate of anything, probably about maybe 300 years old. And the reason I'm showing this is because there's been quite a lot of planting of evergreen oaks from the 1900s onward. So just to show that this oak tree has this evergreen oak has been there for some time. The gentleman there, Brian Fitzmaurice, is the house manager within the residence for the ambassador. So we have been good friends over the years, and I can get a sneak preview in these places on occasions. Just to show this shot here, it's a landscape painting from New Brunswick Museum, painted around 1840. Now, the artist is unknown, but it probably captures in a very precise way, really, the landscape and the Áras an Uachtaráin, which formerly the Vice-Regal Lodge here in a way. The balustrade there in front of the building was built in 1835. So the date of 1840 is correct. You'll see the Phoenix column up on the top left hand side there between the trees. That was raised up in 1840 by Decimus Burton. So, you know, it's quite accurate. And of course, what it does show are the magnificent English elm trees that were planted by during the Earl of Chesterfield's period, 1747 or thereabouts. And of course, it shows other activities there: the grazing animals, the deer, the fallow deer, the military, and it seems quite high society people there. But although everyone was allowed into the park from about 1747. Decimus Burton, of course, has been a major player in the landscaping of the Phoenix Park from 1830 to 1850. So really, I suppose the footprint of the landscape we have at the moment is due to Decimus Burton. And this is a map of 1845, which appeared in a parliamentary report at the time. And it shows quite, the dark green on the screen is actually Burton's planting, and the paler green are areas that he beefed up. Now, he had another 5 years, so there was quite some more planting taking place. But you can see, generally, trees were quite sparse in the park at that time. The red parallelogram there you see going down right through the park is Burton's. It sort of encloses his avenue. You see from the top left-hand corner heading down towards the city, you'll see half the avenue to the Phoenix column in the middle, circles of green on either side. Now, he was actually quite clever in extracting money from the authorities, which at the time were the commissioners of woods and forests. What he had actually done was he created the planting on either side without creating the roadway between it, because you may be able to see that also within the parallelogram, you'll see a kind of a yellowish, brownish path going the whole way up from the Phoenix down to Parkgate Street, the lower end there. So that is the proposed extension of what he had done from Castleknock down to the Phoenix. But around that also, you'll see almost, you'll see curving around, coming nearer to the Vice-Regal Lodge, and then passing through the Phoenix column and going up again. You can see the red line there up near Castleknock. You'll see trees again on either side. Now, that was the original avenue. So if you follow that yellow line, it's the original avenue. And then Burton's proposal was to create a new avenue, which he felt avenues should be in straight lines, which I think we probably would all agree with him. And then various proposals. In this case, it was a cluster. The tree planting he had proposed was a cluster of trees on either side, opposite each other. Now, there was also a proposal from the park bailiff, park superintendent at the time, Wilkie, who's a Scot. He wanted to plant an avenue of sequoia dendrons or redwoods. Now, that didn't find favour with the Commissioner of Woods and Forests, so they end up with these roundels of lime trees right down through the centre. Now, that has been since surpassed with new plantings. Different, we talk about this just gives an overview again at the lower end of the park. You'll see the avenue there, tree lines. It's developed from Burton's time. It's followed on and it's become from the roundels on either side. It's now become tree lines of trees from 1894. The slide just coming up on that. This also shows, you see the zoo there on the left-hand side, and then mainly the playing fields on the right-hand side. It also shows just up with the single tree up on the right-hand side there near our Snookdron, you'll see the allotments that were there at the time on the polo grounds. So this dates the shot to the late 1940s. So we can see there individual tree clumps of trees, again some ceremonial trees in the location there, just above the things. Just above the top of the Wellington testimonials, you'll see three isolated trees, which was a planting for Arbor Day in the early 1900s. So we just carry on here. This is a slide from a photograph from a park map from about 1905. And really what it does, it's a very interesting map from the National Archives. It shows all mainly the plantations of the park as we know them today, dating from about 1840s. So here they have put in, you can see how from this individual lines of trees, from the roundels of trees in the past, they now have used 3 lines of trees. So 2 limes, 3 lines of trees. The outer ones are the beech trees. You can see those planted in 1894. And then you have the horse chestnuts, also planted around the same period. Now, interesting enough, the other trees on the 2 inner rows here are shown, but no date given. So, and the reason being, these are from the original lime roundels from Burton's time. So they were thinned out and they fit in very well in the overall scheme of things. So obviously that had been doing quite well. So they're the lime trees. So you have every alternate pear, lime, chestnut, lime, and then beech in the back. We shot of the outer 2 lines of those trees here taken during the snow period. And the reason I'm showing this is that one of the features of this avenue, which is marvelous, is that there was sufficient space between the trees, which was about 19 meters, 18 to 90 meters, to successfully replant, which was a scheme that the Office of Public Works undertook as a Millennium Project during the year 2000. So, and here it also shows these what we call the Iron Victorian tree guards, which are ornamental, but also a necessity to keep them from deer damage. Just to mention that in 1990, Dr. Alex Shigo, under the auspices of the Tree Council of Ireland, of course, who we know organised National Tree Week, organised this workshop, the practical part of which took place in the Phoenix Park over 3.5 days. And that had been an inspirational sort of 3.5 days as far as tree care was concerned. You can see Shigo there in the upper slide on the right-hand side, and you'll know John McLaughlin there, Christy Byrne is there, Chris Davis. So there's a lot of people, indeed some of them passed away. The lower slide there, some people may have known Jimmy Fitzpatrick and Noel O'Shea, who have since passed away. So that's some of his tree areas. And as a result of that, I suppose a relationship struck up between ourselves, OPW, and Shigo, and he actually has included photographs of the main avenue, which he was very struck by. Mainly, he said it was one of the finest avenues in the world, and really because of the proportions of the avenue. Usually avenue trees are planted so close that when you go to replant an avenue or renew an avenue, that you have that clear fell, as they have done in Hampton Court and places like that, with major controversies over it. But Phoenix Park, because of the space, no felling had to take place unless the tree was dangerous or whatever. But there was enough space to interplant a completely new avenue along for the 2.25 miles. And now avenues also, they don't last forever, of course. And this is the Furs Road Avenue. People coming in from Knockmaroon Gate used to be able to drive at an angle by the ordnance and come out onto Chesterfield Road or Chesterfield Avenue. This was a commemorative avenue that was planted in 2016 to commemorate all the war dead over the period from 1916 in all the wars. So it's a lovely scheme, the brainchild of one of the commissioners, and of course, Margaret Gormley and Paul McDonald were very instrumental in sort of bringing all this and you can see the here. So 172, the whole length, and will be quite magnificent. And there is a history of some plane trees already grown in the Phoenix Park, so hopefully do well. But interestingly, this was made possible because two previous avenues that existed on this line, one was Camperdown elms, which were felled, had to be felled in the probably in the 1960s. And Camperdown elms, as you know, are more resistant to Dutch elm disease, but the virulent strain took care of them and they had to be felled. Then they were replanted by chestnut, so the avenue in the 1970s. So they succumbed quite badly to the canker on this particular area, maybe due to dampness, but the trees weren't overly healthy and they were felled, and this is really what has placed them. So along the area, and you can see a little bit of razzmatazz. Coming back to the map I mentioned, a lot of the trees that were planted in the Phoenix Park, from the lower end here, you see a mixed plantation as you come in Island Bridge Gate on the left-hand side, 1844. So that's really the extent of the dating that appears on this really wonderful manuscript map. And it shows along the Khyber at the different years the plantations were in, a lot of them 1892, 1888, and so on. Now, interestingly, these plantations took place between those periods, 1880 and 1900, before the Great Storm, or the very significant storm that took place in the Phoenix Park and around the country in 1903, where there was over 3,000 trees felled. We'll come to that, but also storms also create opportunities for planting, and it's probably one of the things that helped the bureaucrats or the administration to provide monies. The storm that took place in 1839 in January of that year was an enormous help to Decimus Burton, because there was over 500 trees felled in that storm. So, and obviously they were coming from a low base, so that provided, I suppose, the climate to provide funding, and a lot of funding was spent at that time. So roll on to 1903 storm, and we have here, I just showed the shot here. This is at the English elms, the clumps that would have been on either side of the avenue from Chesterfield's time. So some of those still survived at the lower end of the park. Indeed, they survived in a number of areas along the old avenues, which we will see in the next slide. So you're looking at a slide here, Lawrence collection around 1903. This is the Great Storm, February 27th, 1903. 3,000 trees were felled in the Phoenix Park with that storm. 1,750 of those were Hawthorn, Crataegus species. A lot of the other trees were mainly the old elm trees, English elm, that had been planted they were being planted in the 1740s, 1747 onwards. This is along the back road, the elms across. The people looking there, these are students from the Royal Hibernian Military School with their masters over to have a look. So it's a postcard shot that I picked up somewhere, and it shows very interesting. The roots on the left-hand side of the first tree show quite a lot of healthy young roots on the surface. But the problem is they were grown on the side of a dike, or yes, a dike, a long area here dug out for drainage. So what had happened there is that dike had filled with water to the brim. So really, when the wind came, there was very little. The soil would have been like porridge, so there would be very little to hold those roots, even though some of them are healthy. Now, some of the deeper roots may have been, they may have decayed. But and the reason that I'm quite sure of this sort of scenario is that the storm, the Hurricane Charlie, came in 1987. Now it was August, and the trees were in lead. And along the main road, where you had the swales on either side with the lime trees and various trees growing, there was a huge amount of damage done, partly because the soil was so wet and partly because the trees were in lead. but also the same situation. The trees just pulled out of the ground. So it's something, I suppose, that we'll probably need looking at in the context of the recent storms, is that where there's been poor drainage, there has been a lot of involved, and I think there'll be a whole lot of lessons learned from the recent storms. Just another few shots here. You see the Wellington in the distance again. These are the clumps of trees from the original avenue, Chesterfield Avenue, that were planted in the 1740s. You can see some of them pulled out of the ground. Probably the roots not great in this situation, and others just snapped halfway up, probably indicating maybe where branches had been broken off previously and decays had set in. The group of gentlemen there were the consultants, primarily William Goldring, who was employed along with other people that are working from the director of the Botanic Gardens and so on. The follow through then of the 1903 storm, the response was to cut the trees that were remained standing, with to trim them back, to pollard them as much as possible. This is a similar shot on both sides, and the significance of this is that pollarding is fine but the pollarding needs to happen on a fairly regular basis every few years. If it's allowed to go on for a number of years, what happens is that the branches become unstable at the point of connection where they re-sprout from it. And this is a shot here taken at the I guess around, I think, 1906 or 1907. You see the sprouts coming from the pollarded sections of these elm trees. And of course, when these get strong, they're not really rooted into the main trunk, are really rooted around the extension of the branch that has been pruned. So they become unstable, and then they become a liability legally and otherwise. This slide also shows the cone-shaped trees there are actually the tree plant, the trees donated by Lord Ardilaun from St. Anne's. He was a specialist in the growing of evergreen oaks. And these trees, amazingly, were 8 to 9 feet tall at the time, bare-rooted, planted out in February, March in that planting season. And wisely, the superintendent of the day, a fellow called Robert Anderson, a Scottish horse, he'd only plant them on condition that there was a water supply put in, so that there was water on tap to water these trees. Otherwise, he said, none of them would survive. And as a result of his wisdom and so on, in relation to water and the good planting, none of those trees died. So Lord Ardilaun had actually donated 800 trees. We'll have a look at some of those. And just a little box down at the lower end are the cross cuts, no chainsaws at the time. First chainsaw introduced to the park was in 1950, a McCullen 2-man chainsaw, which we still have up here in the stores. But you can see the various types of, which amazed me when I seen them. They're still here, 3 racks of these cross cuts. Some of them single-handed there, the 2 top ones, the lower ones, and obviously that was to get a different type of grain on the one if they were being cut for floors or furniture or whatever. And you can see them there. Of course, things have speeded up as well. These are some of the trees. Lord Ardilaun donated 800 these magnificent trees, which were considered to be worth about £4,000 at the time, which was a huge sum of money. And there's we've uncovered a little monument here on a limestone face playing up near the second light there, discreetly put in, and this was being cleared up a few years ago. Just another thing to say about people feel that evergreen oaks are dreary, and they are for about 11 and a half months of the year, or 11 months of the year. But in May, June, you get this wonderful colouring. A whole variation of greens, and in fact, when Shaika was over, it was around that period, and he said, "This is the 40 shades of green," which was a very astute observation coming from him. And it's really when the leaves are falling at the time. So you do get, and they're very good to take pruning. That original tree I showed in the American Ambassador's residence was heavily pruned, and it's also heavily diseased with Ganoderma and various bracket fungi. But the reason probably it survived is that it was pruned, and the crown is actually quite small on it, so that allows it to continue on. Next slide here. We just say a few words about, just incidentally, there are about 8 plantations of evergreen oaks from that period. Some of them along the main avenue here, and some of them along the back road, the north road up between Ashdown Gate and Capra Gate, and also back around the visitor centre as well. Some of the viewers might be able to help on this one. This is a slide of Hawthorn taken up near the Knockmaroon Gate. And it's always fascinated me to see such incredible variation that there is in the Hawthorns. You can see here going from right over, well, you know, very sparsely, those leaves are quite glossy and green. Then you have incredible flowering density of flowers, and then different variations as you go to your left. Now, the reason for this is, of course, is they're grown from seed, as was the same reason you got the variation in the green colors on the evergreen oaks, is because they were all grown from seed out in St. Anne's. So we have here, so each leaf, there's several references to Lord Lieutenants come back to Chesterfield's period. You all like to have these Crataegus Hawthorns planted. So there was a continuous plantation continuous planting of Hawthorn, and I've never really known. I mean, they're beautiful tree to look at in spring. They're wonderful in the haws in the autumn time, but I could never really find a reason why there would be this sort of affinity to Crataegus trees or Toxicantha. So there and around, and of course, I mentioned the storm in 1903, 1,750 of those were Hawthorns that were blown down, down 100 in the 1839 storm. So it's quite interesting. Now these are more modern plantings of them. Well, when I say more modern planting, this was Hawthorn that was planted at the top of the Furry Glen in the 1940s, 50s, around that period. And you can just see just how fantastic they are in terms of you know, the flowering springtime and so on. And again, you can see the variation in the flowering habit, in the foliage habit, and so on. Now, I can't say if these were taken from the park, possibly were, seeing that such variation is there, but I can't be 100% sure of that. Just on a little bit on the tree groups then, the dead elephant, this is a group, well, yeah, similarly a group of trees on the upper glen, and just a little exercise I carried out at one stage. The center of this group here was planted with elephants, so there was, you know, there was no problem in relation to felling them. I mean, they had to be taken down carefully so they didn't damage the other trees around them. But it's an expensive business felling one individual mature tree, as we know, that if it has to be taken down piecemeal, it's expensive business. So the park was big enough, we reckon the major problem with tree planting is trees get planted and then they get forgotten about for a long time again, without any thought of sort of you know, variation, age succession, or variation in groups. And this is also a problem that has happened during the recent storms as well. The shelter belts also come to the very strong winds, where the winds were very difficult. I'm just after reading a report on Castlewellan, where there were thousands of trees fell during the recent storm. And part of those were the actual, first of all, the shelter belts collapsed, and then that opened the way up for the wind tunnels and various and the rarest of trees and so on have been felled there. But the idea here, I mean, the park was big enough to take a little designer's license here to plant pockets of different species on the perimeter. So this was immediately giving us, you know, some variation here. Now, these trees are now probably, they were planted back in the 80s and the 90s. So they've nearly caught up with some of the size-wise of the other mature trees. Now, this centerpiece hasn't been planted yet, but it also offers an opportunity to further increase the age succession in the plantation. So that's really what's needed. And I think in relation to shelter belts, there also needs to be a succession of planting. So when the older trees are gone or should be felled, you have a younger group coming in. So you're getting that variation. And of course, this is really what's happened. And I think there will be probably quite a bit thinking. Just some of the rare trees, it's a broadleaf parkland by and large for the trees that are out in the public areas. But in some of what we call the enclosures, Ars Nucleron, Ambassador's Residence, US Ambassador Residence, down at the Visitor Centre, which used to be under secretaries. And of course, this is up at Whitefields where the park's offices are, the local offices are. And this is the garden of the superintendent's residence. And you can see some of them, some of the trees here at the end. These trees would have been planted in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s by Wilkie, who experimented with trees on the basis that they might be suitable for planting out in parklands and so on. Now, it never got to that stage because the idea of keeping with the broadleaf parkland continued on. Wilkie was particularly, I mentioned, he wanted to plant an avenue of redwoods along the Chesterfield Avenue. He probably got his way in the Vice Regal Lodge because there was a plantation, an avenue on the Queen's Walk in the Vice Regal Lodge, planted probably in the 1890s. Now they were interplanted among English elms, so they were actually grubbed out probably in the 1900s. They just didn't survive. And one thing I've noticed is that sequoia den redwoods, they don't like any competition, certainly from other species. Now, they certainly don't mind their own, but not other species. So there is a lesson there. And invariably, never see a pointed sequoia dendron as either windblown or lightning strike or whatever. Now, there are other trees here that you quite noticeable. One here, in fact, here, Peconia excelsa, only two species in it. And I had thought for years that this was another evergreen oak, or yeah, I actually thought it was evergreen. Didn't up to so, but Cormac Downey, when Cormac was tree officer here in the Phoenix Park, close look I had, and he said, no, that's a Peconia. So is to say every day is a school day. So we're very pleased to find that out. And of course, Western red cedar here is dominant around the various lodges in the park and also the enclosures. And it's really, the Western cedar was a signature tree of Decimus Burton. So he liked to plant wherever he went, have some of these Western red cedars, which either to frame a lodge or as a backdrop and so on. The superintendent in the 1920s, Robert Anderson, well, 1900-1923, his signature was laurel. Now, people might criticize him for laurel, but the thing behind it was that was an excellent screen tree, you know, it's certainly around the perimeter of the park. So, yeah, just, and we've another, yeah, the redwoods here were the tree of choice for ceremonial planting. And so when Queen Victoria came, paid 4 visits to Ireland, and she came in 1861. There was a ceremonial tree planting here. Now, that's the one tree. You can see the central, if you like, the mother tree in the center, and the rest are the branches that have swept down to the ground and swept back up again. So you can see, yeah, the cathedral effect of these trees. It happens with Tuya plicatus, also with chamois cypress. Now, if they're left there, but the tendency is to prune the lower branches above. They're left in that situation. And of course, what happens there is to create their own eco-environment, because the leaves drop there, they're off the tree, and they nourish it and so on. You can see a little bit of thinning coming through that. So, you know, there's always the concern that, you know, it may need even further nourishment. But I was looking at the one in the Botanic Gardens last week. The center one now has been cut, but the remaining branches that have sprung up are still there. So it's they obviously don't last forever, but they are a tree of choice. But there are problems with them. When I lived in the park, when I came first to the park, it was here in 1990. Well, I came in there in 1984, but 1996, I think it was. There was a huge explosion beside the house in the middle of the night. It was about 2 o'clock. That was a bomb going off, but it was actually a lightning strike on the sequoia and the sequoia dendron. Within you know, I mean, if the tree had fallen, it would have fallen on the house, but it took the 20, probably the top 20 meters of the tree. And these, and you see on the ground is what was as a result of the lightning strike. So quite extraordinary. And I just put that little slide up on the top right hand side because it illustrates very shows principles of how branches are attached to trees and the effort that trees make to block off. You can see a natural tanning here, kind of tar, that to prevent the decay from penetrating in the trunk of the tree. So we have yeah, I mean, there was an opportunity seen to publicize on this. So that you see the tree on the left-hand side, Tony Malacca here in the harness and up on the tree. So it made for good television. And here we have David Shaw Smith. People may remember, some people may remember the HANDS program where you looked at the various great skills people had either in wheelwrighting or blacksmithing or glass making. So he came aboard and they filmed it, and it was just quite interesting. And we teamed up at the time with a chap called can I think of his name here? He is Liam O'Neill. We teamed up with Liam because every time a large tree fell, blown down or had to be cut for health reasons, Liam approached us and he said, "I'd like to use that for wood turning." So from that point of view, and because arts was part of the OPW remit at the time, we allowed Liam very kindly to have the timber free gratis. Now, we always thought there should be some payback, you know, and we've asked Liam we thought it'd be lovely if he could do a timber piece on each different species in the park. And we managed to muster up 100 different species between trees and shrubs, but we really were scraping the barrel. We had fuchsia, griselinia, gorse, so some of the smaller mushrooms at the lower end and the lower shelf there is, but now these are all can be seen in the visitor centre. The idea was they were taken around to schools and so on. That didn't happen, but as schools come, they can see them in the visitor centre. And it's a good way of knowing what you have. And I'm saying this in the context of the rare trees that blown down in places like Castlewellan and Kilmacurra, any of those centres. And you know, it's a great way of keeping the tree alive, as it were, because you can tell the story even if you don't have the rarest tree that has been blown down. If you've been unfortunate enough not to have taken cuttings and propagating it previously, it's a way of focusing on it and bringing people's attention, you know, to what was there, and even to see the different types of. There's about 5 different types of oak that's in this particular display, and you can see the difference in the timber. So for people that's interested in timber and wood and so on, it's a wonderful display. And of course, Liam then graduated from the ridiculous to the sublime. He started to use chainsaws to cut his large pieces, which he called hollow form. So you can get these scattered around redwoods around various places like St. Enda's and down in Borcastle and so on. Yeah, I think that's probably it. If there's any, I'm sure there may be some questions people might want to ask or some contributions or whatever.
Yeah, thanks a million, John. That was great. Don't know if you want to grab a drink of water before we lash into the questions.
No, work away, Mark. Thanks.
Right. Well, if anyone has a question, if they want to pop it into the chat, or they can put themselves on camera and unmute themselves. But I'm going to start off with a couple of questions of my own. John, I suppose that last screen where you're showing the 100 different species that are in the park, is there species that grow well in the park that we're not necessarily using in other parks in Dublin and around the country that we might want to consider?
Good question, Mark. Yeah, I mean, there's a wide palette. There's, even though there's the 100 species there in the park, they're mainly a lot of the common broadleaves, you know, and the the range of, as I mentioned, oak there, you know, there would be other ones. But a lot of those would also be shrubs. And much to my surprise, I mean, Gristolinia can grow to tree size as it is here in the park. So there would be, now, I would say there would be species here that would be suitable for parks, not necessarily for street planting. So I would probably need to go away and think about that one, Mark. You know, but we do have the list of those plantings there, so we'd be glad to pass those on at some stage.
Great. And another question is kind of maybe the same question, but from a different perspective. Is there trees that are doing very well in the park, so well that they're self-seeding themselves that we mightn't be aware about and might want to be a bit cautious about planting around the place?
Another good question, Mark. Yeah, well, of course, you know, it's a deer park, so a lot of the seedlings get mopped up fairly quickly. You might get one season out of them, but most of the common ones, of course, are self-seeded. But certainly in the enclosures, we find that something like the Western Thuya plicata, the Western red cedar, very prolific, and you'll find it around anywhere it is. It sort of grows. You know, very prolific and a good source of seedlings if you wanted to establish a nursery there. I'm not so sure if there's any of them that would be problematic, you know, in relation to becoming an invasive species, you know, irrespective of they're native or imported. So no, I don't think I can pinpoint any of those, Mark, for you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
You've a lot of fan mail in the chat, not so many questions. Christy says, well done, John, a great arboricultural tour of the park. Elma Fenton says, very informative, John, regards from your former student, Elma. Maria
Yes, very nice, Elma.
says, thank you so much for the presentation, very interesting. And her question is, out of curiosity, would you know what are the oldest trees or species in the park and how old?
Yeah, I think probably, you know, it is, I mean, we don't know what the oldest are, but I mean, I mentioned the evergreen oak. I think that probably would be kind of, but there are also very old oak trees. And these are mainly on the entrance to the visitor center there at the Phoenix Column, because at one stage there's a Malton print that shows that whole area, a small woodland, actually, you know, intersected with pathways. It was a formal area, and they were oak trees. So if that's the case, that they're the remnants. Now, I used to think that because of the new entrance created into the visitor center, which can be a good or a new building like the Gate Lodge there, you know, that might spawn an initial planting. And I would say, yeah, that's the Gate Lodge is 1802, so the trees are there from 1802. So that we live in those 225. But I'm now thinking that there are probably some of those older trees that go back to the Malton prints of 1790, and even before that, even 1770, because the print shows those as quite well, certainly more than semi-mature trees, you know, 30 or 40 years of age.
Thanks, John. So Lei Ching is asking, is there any future plan regarding climate change regarding the park?
Well, now, yeah, I can't tell you. I'm not totally up to speed there. I'd have to refer over to to Paul McDonald, the current superintendent, and Margaret Gormley. But I do know, yeah, there's a whole strategy in their management plan in relation to climate change, you know, and also in relation to drainage and, you know, water retention and swales and so on. So I would imagine that with 1/3 of the park planted, that there is probably opportunities certainly to renew some of the older woodlands. You know, now that might take fencing in and so on. There has been a small trial area done up in a number of years ago up near Knockmaroon, which has been totally fenced in and just left to nature, because the feeling was at the time that if the deer weren't allowed to interfere with these open pasture lands that were fenced in, that you'd get a huge amount of growths of oaks and various species coming up. But that actually hasn't been the case in this particular instance. It's more like brambles and briars, and now there's also an ash trial which commenced with Cormac Downey there, looking at Killara. So there is an experimental element to that now at this stage. Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. Question from David Bossonet. Would you have any views or opinions on some local authorities in Ireland's insistence that all new trees planted in urban areas and parks be native?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that might be pushing things a bit far. You know, I think that, well, park areas, I think you would cut out a range of species that would be of interest to people, you know, even on the global area. I don't think I would be more, I suppose, middle of the road situation. Certainly, I would say there's room for both of them, and I think that you know, the native species is really something for much larger expanses in the countryside. You know, that there would be parts of national parks and so on, but there would be a place for them certainly, and but not exclusively, I wouldn't imagine. As in the arboricultures and the horticultures, I think there's a richness in the diversity of the global palette of trees.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of the climate change question, obviously one of the common strategies is to diversify the amount of species being planted generally, just in case one or two go down. So you're not left with nothing.
Yeah. But that's a very important point, Mark, because as I mentioned, the elms are gone and it's here, the ash is gone, and you know, diversity is the answer in terms of you know, your insurance policy for the future.
Question from Yura, which I think I'm not sure you might want to come on microphone and clarify, but I think this is probably in relation to forestry rather than parks. But the question is, given today's environmental challenges, do you have any thoughts on switching from switching the aesthetic from a static scene of monoculture of tree species into a mixture of variety of species to make stronger ecosystems and plantings more resistant and diverse?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was at a very interesting panel discussion on Sunday at the launch of National Tree Week, and a very informative group of people speaking on that very question. And what had emerged was that the citrus spruce is really the bread and butter of you know, the Irish forestry industry, and it's providing huge resources, timber resource for building our houses, which means we don't have to import them. But there's also that for the last number of decades, there's a requirement to plant broadleaf species in around the perimeters of these forests. Now it doesn't, and also the waiting time for a broadleaf woodland to mature from an investor's point of view could be a long wait. Now again, it's really a compromise, and I'm sure there's opportunities there to incorporate both, and of course the wider the greater the range of species is, the greater the ecosystem is. But just to give a shout out that there's a realism there in terms of what's the bread, and also to attract investors going forward into investing in this. And of course, a lot of people would again have been put off with storm damage and so on. But it is apparently quite a lucrative area. The problem has been, of course, there has been the issue of licensing, and the controls around it has been pretty dire over the last decade or so. So that has to be rectified.
Thanks, John. I think it comes back to the risk again of relying on a monoculture.
Yes.
I believe there's a beetle in the UK, I think it's called the eight-toothed beetle, that has a taste for Sitka spruce, and the forestry industry is pretty worried that gets going, that it could really wipe out all the cycad plantains more or less.
Yeah, and it's also in Germany, and there's a lot of research going on in Germany and that, and they're also looking at species that might replace the sitka. So, and that's also there's an awareness here as well. And of course, we're very fortunate to have Avondale with those wonderful plots that have been planted for the last 100 odd years, nearly. That you know, people are able to try them out. Things like hemlock, and you know, there's a range of species there that could be, and I think it's absolutely right as well, and I'm sure they can yield good timber for housing as well.
Yeah. I think we'll have one last question, and then we'll leave you off the hook, which is from Orla Farrell, and it's Orla wants to know, have you a signature tree?
Oh, have I a signature tree? That's a nice question, Orla, to finish up on. Well, I have two favorite trees. Well, one of them is the silver birch. Because it probably doesn't cause too much hassle, especially if it's planted near houses. Now, people are always worried about trees bringing down their house or their wall or so on. So, but I like it for its beauty and its aesthetics, and you know, winter color, all that goes with silver birch. But I also like the oak trees, the common oak, common robber, for its longevity and, you know, sturdiness, and you know, hopefully, you know, that can continue on without. I know there's various phytophthors affecting oak trees, but that can continue on. So they would be my two picks, Orla. Thanks for that.
Thanks a million, John. We'll leave it there. Just like to
Okay,
thank
Mark.
Hazel for her assistance in running this, and Gemma Carr and Anne Merkel for proposing the webinar in the first place. And especially to you, John, thanks very much for giving us the talk. And I'd like to advertise then as well our next webinar, which is coming up on the 27th of March at 1 p.m. and that'll be with Sally O'Halloran, and the title is Turning the Green to Grey, Plant-Driven Design in Sheffield. And I think Sally will be focusing on planting for rain gardens in particular, which should be good.
Great.
So, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks a million, John.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for everyone for coming in. Many thanks.